Welcome to our panel, Citizenship and Exploration. And we wish you a good, if sober, World Refugee Day. Our panelists tonight are John Witt, Madelon Baranoski, Charles Dike, Jaak Rakfeldt, and Amal Azzudin, and I will introduce them properly in a few minutes. And a thank you to Lucille Bruce for brainstorming with us, for organizing us, and oh yes, for thinking of this in the first place. And thanks also to Chad Herzog, Liz Fisher, Tom Griggs, and the crew of the Festival of Arts and Ideas for hosting us and being interested enough in citizenship to have this evening, and to Katrina and Tiffany and the rest of the crew. I used to be involved with theater, so I have great appreciation for the people who set up the stage and then sort of guide you through the performance. Also want to note that over there are some poster board paper and some maps, and there's some questions about citizenship, and feel free later on to write down your thoughts. Some of you, when you heard that the festival was hosting a panel on citizenship, might have thought, oh, so this will be about legal citizenship and undocumented immigrants and asylum seekers, and you'd be right in part. It is about those things, and Professor Witt will be grounding us in some of the important aspects of citizenship as a legal status. Yet people's understanding and experiences and perceptions of citizenship are varied. And our panelists will be exploring some of these variations on experiences and perceptions and understanding of citizenship from their personal and professional lives. My main connection to citizenship over the past 20 years began with outreach to people who were homeless and who were experiencing a certain kind of citizenship, the non-citizenship kind. Not legal non-citizenship in most cases, but in the sense of lacking access to the 5 R's of rights, responsibilities, roles, resources, and relationships that people need to be full participating members of their communities and society, along with a sense of belonging that's validated by others. And this past couple of weeks, a few colleagues who have been working with us doing this citizenship work for us for years put together a film. Went out on the streets of New Haven, and I won't say any more than that. We should go right into the film, and then we'll move ahead with our panelists in a few minutes.
Citizenship means to me being an equal person in society and being able to have a say about the things that matter to you.
It means to me being free. Volunteering and community activism is a part of that, like, making a difference in somebody that might have been where you used to be at.
È quella cosa che ti lega alla nazione, la tua nazione dove sei nato, dove vivi e dove magari costruisci una famiglia.
Absolute 100% equality, and that's something that we'll probably never ever have.
Living with other people of different backgrounds, of different origins, of different races and stuff, and all coming together for the common good.
Be a working man, provide for your family.
Brotherhood, family.
Just having a sense of belonging to something greater than yourself.
Being an integral part of a group process, each individual is treated equally.
Ser ciudadano es simplemente el lugar donde uno vive.
Give and take to the community. It's not just like yourself, you're a part of the community.
Well, that you can cycle to work.
Collective action where people work together, to improve the situation, maybe culturally, educationally, economically, for all of us, in a way that includes all people, regardless of race, class, gender.
It means taking care of your neighbor, taking care of yourself.
I have a voice. I have a chance to
make a difference in someone's life.
Willing participation in an environment where you live.
Participating in his community events and telling my life story and listening to other people's life story, and also sharing my musical talents, especially the violin, and sometimes singing in church.
How you develop common attributes and common goals with people around you.
I'm an immigrant. Citizenship is a great thing. That's a lot of opportunity, right? You got it, you can do anything you want, you can go to school.
What it means to be a citizen is to be responsible for our community.
Community.
Connecting with your community, giving back to your community.
Communicating together, fellowshipping together.
You feel like you're equal with other people.
I should have access to education. I should have access to housing. I shouldn't have to be on welfare, be the working poor. It's like we should be able to have everything that the rich people have and not be put in this poverty class.
Proud to be in America, I guess, and hope that foreigners become U.S. citizens in our country.
It's something earned. I don't even believe people born in this country should be just given citizenship. It's something that you should serve your country.
That I'm a part of my country and that I represent some of the views of my country. I have certain rights and freedoms.
We don't live in isolation. We're surrounded by other people. So we should be concerned with the welfare of everybody else.
A bunch of different people being able to get along with and accept people for who they are. Wow, that's a wide open question.
Nicely done. Thank you. I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists, and they will then speak in the order in which I'm introducing them. We won't have questions in between them, but at the end we will have time for discussion, questions from the audience, perhaps some discussion among the panelists. So John Fabian Witt is an author and legal historian and the Alan H. Duffy Class of 1960 Professor of Law at Yale Law School. His most recent book, Lincoln's Code, The Laws of War in American History, was awarded several prizes and special recognition and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Professor Witt is currently writing the story of the men and women behind the Garland Fund, the 1920s foundation that financed efforts that culminated in Brown versus the Board of Education. He's also co-editing a scholarly edition of a lost 19th century manuscript on martial law during the Civil War era, and is the author of several other books, including the prize-winning The Accidental Republic, Crippled Workingmen, Destitute Widows in the Remaking of American Law. Madelon Baranoski has a PhD in clinical psychology and is an MSN in nursing. MSN is nursing. She has served as an Army nurse, including a year's tour in Vietnam. Dr. Baranoski is a professor of psychiatry in the Yale School of Medicine, a member of the Law and Psychiatry Division of the Department of Psychiatry and CMHC, and she developed the Community Forensic Services program based at CMHC. She participates in the Yale Law School Veterans and Immigration Clinics, serves on the Police Crisis Intervention Team as part of the Connecticut Alliance for the Benefit of Law Enforcement, and helped develop the Prisoner Reentry Programming for the Department of Correction, and she chairs a committee of the Human Investigation Committee at the Yale School of Medicine. Charles Dike is medical director for the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, where he oversees the care of individuals in state-run mental health hospitals and programs. He is associate program director of Law and Psychiatry Fellowship Program at Yale and assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Yale. Dr. Dike completed medical school in Nigeria and a psychiatric residency in England, and was awarded membership in the Royal College of Psychiatrists of England. Dr. Dike is a distinguished fellow in the American Psychiatric Association, past president of the Connecticut Psychiatric Society, and fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists of England. And he's widely consulted on issues of ethics in forensic mental health care. Jaak Rakfeldt is professor of social work at Southern Connecticut State University, where he is also the coordinator of the Co-Occurring Disorders, Mental Health and Substance Use cohort program. In addition, he is an assistant clinical professor at the Yale University School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. He serves as a clinical consultant and conducts seminars and colloquia at various community mental health agencies, has over 50 publications and more than 100 conference presentations, primarily dealing with mental health and substance use issues, as well as ethnic identity. He also maintains a clinical private practice, and over the past 6 months, he's been on sabbatical from Southern at the Yale Program for Recovery and Community Health, where we've been happy to have him, and he's become quite involved in our citizenship research. Amal Azzudin is a campaigner for human rights and social justice in Scotland, where she serves as Human Rights and Equalities Officer for Refugees at the Mental Health Foundation. Ms. Azzudin is one of the Glasgow Girls, a group of 7 school girls who campaigned against dawn raids, detention, and deportation of asylum seekers in Glasgow. Their story has since been turned into 2 BBC documentaries, a stage musical, and a television musical drama. Ms. Azzudin continues to campaign for the rights of asylum seekers, and in 2016 was named one of the Saltire Society's Outstanding Women of Scotland. She serves as an ambassador for the Scottish Refugee Council, and she has a BA in Community Development and Masters in Human Rights and International Politics from the University of Glasgow. So please welcome our panelists. And Professor Witt.
Thank you, Michael, for those really generous introductions. Thank you, Lucille, for putting this together. And I'm looking forward to hearing from each of the panelists. I think my job today, as I understand it, is to mostly get out of the way so we can hear from the amazing stories that will follow. But what I'd like to do is provide a little bit of a background on the law of citizenship, principally in the United States, as a kind of baseline for the conversation, and then connect up the law of citizenship, which I think is in a kind of crisis in the world today, to the crisis of social citizenship that we saw a little bit about in the video, and that some of the rest of the panelists will talk about. Legal citizenship is in the news in all sorts of ways these days. I mean, think of the DREAM Act children, think of any number of immigration questions, which are not all citizenship questions. Not all immigration questions are citizenship questions, but some of them are. And just last week, citizenship was in the news at the US Supreme Court. So last week, the US Supreme Court decided a fascinating citizenship case that I think captures the tension at the heart of questions about citizenship in the here and now. It was a case of a man named Luis Ramon Moreno Santana, who'd lived in the United States since he was 13 years old, since 1975. He was born in 1962 in the Dominican Republic, and during the course of his adult life, he'd been convicted of a number of crimes in federal court. And the United States decided some years ago to remove him as a result of his criminal convictions from the United States. But Mr. Moreno Santana said, "You can't remove me. I'm a citizen of the United States." And then the question was posed, was Mr. Moreno Santana a citizen of the United States or not? And the Moreno Santana case helps us focus on what's at stake in citizenship. So Mr. Moreno Santana said he was a citizen, but the United States said he was not. And the reason he was not was that although his father had been, the reason according to the United States that he was not, was that his father had been a US citizen, and Mr. Moreno Santana had been born in the Dominican Republic to an American citizen father. But his father, according to the United States, had not lived in the United States long enough, had not lived a full 10 years in the United States, such that his children born out of the United States would automatically become citizens by dint of having been born to a United States father. In fact, Mr. Moreno Santana's father had lived in the United States 20 days too few. 20 days too few. 9 years, 345 days, rather than 9 years, 365 days. Mr. Moreno Santana developed a fascinating argument about why his 20 missing days shouldn't count against him. And the argument was that mothers were treated differently. The United States required that American citizen mothers giving birth to children abroad only live in the United States for 1 year. Fathers, 10 years, mothers, 1 year. And Mr. Moreno Santana said, this is an unlawful discrimination against fathers or the children of fathers. It treats women and men differently to the disadvantage of fathers and their children. And in the case last week, the United States Supreme Court agreed with Mr. Moreno Santana. They said there's nothing other than old-fashioned stereotypes that would justify this distinction between women and men. This statute, this inequality is unconstitutional. But then the court did a fascinating thing. The court decided that Mr. Moreno Santana wasn't therefore made a citizen. Actually, it was the reverse. The rule would become 10 years for everyone, rather than 1 year for everyone. And so Mr. Moreno Santana looks at the likely prospect of removal from the country now as a result of this case. And I talk about this case because it's from last week, and because it brings out what's at the heart, I think, of citizenship as a matter of law in the United States, which is inclusion, and we saw some of the themes of that in the video, but also exclusion. And so citizenship law is about inclusion and exclusion throughout. And if we look at the American Constitution, we can see this, I think. So in the United States Constitution, we start with the phrase, we the people. Well, who are we the people? We the people are the citizens of the United States, I think is the obvious implication. And that has both an inclusion and an exclusion. And we can see that in any number of references to citizenship in the Constitution. The 14th Amendment, Section 1, ratified in 1868, right after the Civil War, provides that no state shall deny the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. So citizens of the United States get privileges and immunities that cannot be denied. What's interesting about these features of the Constitution is that they've got both the inclusion and the exclusion pieces. But not all parts of the Constitution have that structure. In fact, the word citizen is used remarkably little in the American Constitution, on my reading. You won't find the word citizen in the Bill of Rights at all. It doesn't appear in the first 10 amendments, which means things like free speech or the right to due process do not require that one be a citizen. Your freedom to exercise your religion does not turn on your being a citizen as a matter of the text of the American Constitution. And the heart of this for the modern American Republic is in the 14th Amendment, when it provides that no state shall deny due process or equal protection of the laws to any person. It's not about citizens, it's about persons. And now this brings out an important theme, because these persons provisions, which in some sense are now more ubiquitous in the Constitution than citizenship provisions. The person provisions are about human dignity and human rights. They're like a charter for human rights written into the American Constitution that functions without regard to citizenship or non-citizenship. Now, there are good reasons for these, what I'm calling human rights provisions in the American Constitution. And some of those reasons have to do with the long history of unjustifiable and terrible exclusions from citizenship in the American Constitution. So from 1790 forward, 1790, that's a long time ago, it's at the very beginning of the Republic. In 1790, the Congress enacts a law that provides that no one other than a white person may be naturalized as a citizen in the United States. Naturalized means moving from somewhere else, becoming a citizen having been born somewhere else. So only white persons may be naturalized as citizens in the United States from 1790 forward. In 1870, that provision is altered such that people of African descent can be naturalized as citizens. And it's not until 1940 that provision is altered for people of Asian descent. So only white persons from 1790 forward. In the infamous Dred Scott case decided in 1857, it's decided that not only may people of African descent not be naturalized as citizens, they may not be citizens in any fashion. people of African descent born in the United States may not be citizens, even if they are born here, from the Dred Scott case in 1857. That Dred Scott case is overturned by the 14th Amendment, which provides that everyone born in the United States becomes a citizen. Every person born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen of the United States. That's a provision directly overturning the Dred Scott case. But the exclusions persist after the Civil War and Reconstruction. In the early part of the 20th century, if a married woman, American citizen, were to marry a foreign national, she lost her U.S. citizenship. She lost her U.S. citizenship. Now, that didn't turn on the question of whether another country gave her citizenship by dint of marrying a foreign national. The United States didn't care much about that, so some women were rendered stateless by this. That provision, that law was reversed in 1922, but not reversed for American citizen women marrying Asian men. If you married an Asian man, you lost your citizenship until the 1940s. So there's a long history of exclusions from American citizenship, and I think this has helped us focus on the importance of the human rights provisions in the American Constitution. What's interesting about our current moment, I think, and now this is the crisis of legal citizenship, is that in the United States, and in fact around the world, we're seeing a resurgence of some of the forms of exclusion that were once a regular part of our law, but for a long time now seem to have been in decline. Those are resurgent. And here's where I think we can connect up legal citizenship to social citizenship. The question, I think, for many of us is why are we seeing resurgent nationalisms around the world and in the United States? The United States now leading the charge in some ways in this resurgent nationalism. And I think, to my mind, a central reason, a central answer, goes to a crisis of social citizenship, a sense of citizens of republics, democracies, and non-democracies around the world that social belonging is in crisis, that people feel not attached to their communities in the way they once did, and are responding in ways that produce backlashes against people from elsewhere, and are producing real cutbacks in our sense of what legal citizenship should be. So that's a quick background on inclusion and exclusion as a matter of law, and I think a connection that we might see in all of our discussions between the legal citizenship on the one hand and the social citizenship on the other. So thank you. I'm looking forward to the rest of these presentations.
Good evening. It's a privilege to be here, to be part of Arts and Ideas, and to be working with this group. And I've had the privilege of working with Michael Rowe for a long time. And I am humbled here because my opinion shouldn't count any more than any of yours about some of this. But there is a psychology to citizenship, and I think Professor Witt kind of gave the background. I've lived for 70 years without knowing those laws, because I've never run into them. We kind of know laws when we run into them, when there is a kind of a conflict. But there is a psychology to citizenship that lasts forever. I noticed one of you wrote that being a citizen meant everything to you. It was your entire life. It's how you saw yourself, how you think of yourself. So citizenship experience is built on our relationships, our backgrounds, our family histories, our triumphs, our struggles. It's on our lives, right? And so we each have a narrative of citizenship. But there are some, and one particular destructive narrative of citizenship, and it goes beyond the legal standard. And I like to think of it as it's the idea of citizenship that creates a symbol, not of the law of citizen, but treating citizenship a little bit like the American Express card. That you can be a little bit of a citizen. And then there's the platinum citizen. And it's the platinum citizen that gets to define who we are as Americans. And it looks a little bit like that. So when we say we're equal, we're not all equally equal. Now, anybody in there outside here who's a mathematician will be shuddering, right? Because equality is like pregnancy. You are or you're not, right? But not necessarily. Not necessarily. That idea that there's one way to be an American and that it's based on a race or a religion or a history, right, does not leave room for the expansion of ideas and the richness of cultures. And that is exclusionary. And to a large extent, that's kind of what we're hearing now, right? Because those words will tell us who has the access to full citizenship and the rights of full citizenship. For example, why doesn't Flint have the right to clean water? It's a puzzle a little bit. How come they don't have the same right, you know, that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness part, right? Who has the right of voice to say how we should think of ourselves and to say what lives matter? The narrative that divides us into those who are worthy simply by being here longer and not the longest, right? Because if it were the longest, we wouldn't have our reservations filled with people who were here far longer than we were. But it gives us the notion that some of us don't fit, or we don't fit completely, and that our value can be devalued very, very quickly. That narrative is a dangerous narrative because it treats citizenship as a fortress to keep people out. Not only people outside out, but people inside out. It treats people as though their culture is not quite as good, their heritage is not quite as good. You know, it's really interesting right now. If you look on the internet, there's a lot of description about why don't we stop talking about slavery? For God's sakes, it's over. Get over it. It's done. But it's okay to be a daughter of the American Revolution. Now, that was over a lot longer ago. And finally, now, if you're an African-American woman, you can belong to that because there were a lot of African-Americans in the Revolutionary War, but we forgot about them. But that gets who defines what voice is worthwhile. I turn now very quickly, and I'm just going to let these go on behind me. I guess I should hit that button, right? The slides. But there are ideas that can be expressed in terms of art. And I think of Norman Rockwell kind of captured humanity in this, didn't he? This is all of the world. This is the human nature that Professor Witt talked about. And then he also captured in America. This is kind of America. And then in the Saturday Evening Post, and some of you are old enough to remember that magazine, every week the Saturday Evening Post came out, and often it had a picture of by Norman Rockwell, the portrait of America. And that portrait of America was not the mix. Even then, it wasn't the mix, even though we were mixed then. So a narrative that's important to adopt these days is a narrative that celebrates diversity, or at least makes our country safe for it. A narrative that can benefit from a mix of ideas, a different way to think about the world, a different culture. Think of your restaurant experience, of how the mixed cuisines of the world make eating out much more interesting than if we did exactly what was here when the Pilgrims and the Mayflower arrived, right? And so the idea that there is one way to be an American is flying in the face of what I think our ideals are. It's flying in the face of equality. So, what would be a healthy narrative? Well, a healthy narrative would be one that says citizenship should not be a fortress of inclusion-exclusion, but a pathway that elevates people in their struggle to new enlightenment. We do not want to adopt a narrative of hopelessness or despair right now. Because I think the one thing I learned, John, from you, is that when the law was bad, it got to change. And that change came through protest. It came through enlightenment, and that's what we have today. So our going forward, our narrative ought to be about that, about the ideals that we kind of adopt if we're an insider about America and making it true. So that there is one equality, there is one acceptance, and that's what we're going to strive toward. We're not going to leave people out. How do we know when a narrative is bad? It's simple. Just say no to drugs was a bad narrative. It won't work. That there's only one set of countries from which bad people come, which is not true and won't work. We should make America great again, but in a way that America is a society that's great, that offers the best, to give everyone who says citizenship is what I really want, that it's all that I am, that no one feels left out. We have 3 narratives coming up that are so powerful in their impact. I want you to listen of what it would be like if we excluded and went for just the mainstream, the vanilla Americana, which we've never had anyway. And if we're honest with ourselves, we don't want that. We want the richness of our society. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Michael and Lucille for inviting me to this very important discussion. And I'm hoping that at the end of today, your understanding of citizenship will be blown open. That's the goal. It took me a while to understand that citizenship goes way beyond legal citizenship, way beyond as a citizen of a nation where you were born. It took me a long time to understand that. But now I know. Citizenship, goes into you having a sense of belonging, feeling like you belong, having a conviction that you can achieve your God-given potential, that you can be anything you want to be. If you have the ability to do it, you can do it. That there will be no systemic barriers or systemic obstacles to your being able to rise, whether due to race, class, gender, sexual orientation. Nothing can stop you if you have the ability and if you're determined to be who you want to be. Nothing should stop you. That, to me, is citizenship. And, I start just by way of example, just describing my experience growing up in Nigeria. I went to school in Nigeria, medical school, elementary, college, all of it in Nigeria. I had no doubt whom I was. All my role models were Nigerians. They were black. My teachers were black, most of them. My professors were black. I wanted to be a cardiologist. The best cardiologist was black. The vice chancellor of my school was black, was Nigerian. I knew I could be whomever I wanted to be. My sense of identity was formed. I wasn't even thinking about it. It just was. I only began to think about it when I traveled first to England. Then I realized that there's such a thing as racism. It was mild. I didn't recognize it. My fellow residents would say to me, and some other black nurses, "Charles, did you see that? How could they talk to you like that?" I said, "Like what?" I had no clue what they were talking about. As far as I was concerned, human beings were either had an attitude problem or they had an issue and they were not feeling well that day and they talked to me in a funny way. Who cared? But to them, that was a racist comment or a racist behavior. It never stuck because my self-identity was already formed. I knew whom I was. Nothing stuck. Then I came over to the US, and the first experience I had in the US was my 14-year-old therapy patient. I was doing child psychiatry at the time, and this is a really bright, smart, lovely, charming young black boy. And he had gotten this opportunity to go to a leadership training program. But the condition was that an individual, a male in his community, would have to sign off on the form agreeing that they knew him and they were recommending him. A man who was of repute, who had no legal issues or not a felon, nothing. And he came to me to say he couldn't find any such man in his community. Of course, he came to me with the form to fill out, and I was really blown away. I was blown away because even in rural Nigeria, you would find a man who would be able to sign those forms. And it got me thinking, what exactly is going on here? And I began to talk to some of my other colleagues, began to talk to some other black people around, trying to understand the system. And it dawned on me that what I took for granted back home in Nigeria was not quite the same here. There's no such thing as all your teachers are black and therefore you can be. There's no such thing as role models you could look up to. And every child's first role model is what? Apart from your parents, your teachers and other people in authority. I looked up, I went to the bank in Nigeria, the bank manager was Nigerian, he was black. I could be a bank manager. So all these things I took for granted was not here. It wasn't here. In addition to that, this was the crack epidemic, and everyone was being thrown into jail for addictions. And so, again, nobody could see beyond the environment where they were. How can you have a sense of self? How can you have a sense of belonging? How can you have a conviction that you can achieve when you don't see people like you that you can aspire to be like? And then I began to understand when I read Chester Pierce's writings on microaggressions and all of that in the 1970s, and how, from time, this is what Professor Pierce had written, from time, African Americans have been exposed from childhood to what he called microaggressions, micro-insults, dismissals, a belief in the society that you are worthless, a belief that you can't achieve anything, that you are stupid, that you are dumb, that you are a criminal. That's the picture. You come in, your picture tells a story that you are dumb, you are not smart, and you are a criminal. And these children imbibe this growing up. I mentor young children here in New Haven who are black, and I see that. They've already imbibed this. I can't do it. I can't achieve that. Tell them to pick on a position of authority or leadership, and the first thing you hear is, there's no way I can do it. And this coming from individuals I know are extremely bright. I know they're bright. But this is what their story is. Where is the citizenship? What makes you a citizen if you can't believe in your ability to participate in a society in a meaningful way? What makes you a citizen if you don't believe that your voice counts? And so I began to understand that citizenship actually goes beyond the day I earned my American citizenship, which was wonderful. It goes beyond that. How do we empower people to feel that they belong, to feel that they matter, to feel that they are smart, to feel that they can do it? Without us being able to do that, I'm afraid legal citizenship is worthless. Thank you.
So today, I guess, must be my day because it's International Refugee Day. And the theme here is that I've basically spent my life feeling like a refugee. I don't know how many of you followed last year's presidential election in Austria. It lasted from the spring until, I think, December 6th of last year. And the candidates were a right-wing, anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, nationalistic, anti-European Union person by the name of Norbert Hofer, and his opponent was Alexander van der Bellen, a Green Party candidate, who at the end won, the first Green Party candidate in European history. The fact is that van der Bellen's parents fled from Estonia just about the same time that my parents fled from Estonia. So this is my story right here, basically. I was born in a refugee enclave in Sweden. And until I was a teenager, I was stateless, had no country. I was a man without a country, no citizenship. You wonder how does that happen? Well, how it happens is Sweden was the only Western country that recognized the brutal occupation and annexation of Estonia. And as it turns out, I was born in Sweden, and Sweden, you don't become a Swedish citizen by being born there. So I couldn't be a citizen of a country that no longer existed on the map of the world, and I couldn't be a Swedish citizen either. So I didn't become a citizen until I was a teenager, and I was naturalized in the United States. And Professor Witt talked about the exclusionary issues here and so forth. We, as soon as my parents arrived in September 44, in Sweden, they applied to immigrate to the United States. But from the 1920s, there was a law that only people could come. There were slots allocated based on a number of people already in America. And since there are only about 1 million Estonians in the world now, there were not many slots there. So they waited till 1949, and they were afraid because the Swedish government were actually turning back some Baltic refugees, and the Soviet embassy kept enticing my mother to go back, and they got scared. Some of our friends in the refugee enclave pooled their money, secretly bought old, dilapidated Swedish sailing boats, sailed across the Atlantic, men, women, and children, weeks on end, months coming here. Some landed in Nova Scotia, in the islands, the Caribbeans, and some in the southern United States. That's how afraid people were. Finally, Canada opened up, and so we came to Canada. And then a year later, our number came up, and we arrived in America. But since I had lived in an Estonian enclave, I didn't learn to speak Swedish. I didn't speak English in Canada. I learned to speak English when I arrived at school. Now, this is a poem by Ilona Lamen. She's also an Estonian refugee, fled to Sweden. After her father was arrested and executed, she and her mother fled to Sweden. She wrote this poem a number of years ago, and I'm touched by it because it kind of captures a lot of what I've done for a number of years in terms of my own experience, and I've worked with other North American Estonians. And it goes, kui ma ütlen valge, ta ütleb, how nice for you. Kui ma ütlen must, ta ütleb, we shall overcome. Kui ma ütlen sinimustvalge, ta ütleb, kahetsedes, kui raske olla nõnda kirju. When I say white, they say, how nice for you. When I say black, they say, we shall overcome. When I say blue, black, and white, they say, shaking their heads in pity, must be hard to be so motley, checkered. And below is the Estonian flag. It's a blue, black, and white white flag. And that's the whole thing. Not only have I lived this experience, but back in the 70s, I went around North America. I did lectures, workshops, kind of consciousness-raising groups with young Estonians about identity issues. And people, my panelist colleagues here, have talked about the sense of belonging. And it was a revelation. A lot of people said, wow, others feel this too. I actually published 3 articles on it back then. They're all in Estonian, so nobody can read them, unfortunately. But I've lived with this whole thing for a long time. And really, the net result is that how do we come to terms with this being motley, being checkered? And the idea is that we're not going to resolve it. The president of Austria that I was beginning to talk about, when he did finally win the election and all of Europe was holding its breath, because they'd seen what happened with Brexit, they'd seen what happened with Trump, and they'd seen other populist right-wing people emerging in Europe. And then when they saw him emerge, and again, the reporters asked him, who are you as a man? And his response, first out of his mouth, was, I am a refugee. That's the core of his being, and I believe that that never leaves. We have to learn somehow to live with the tensions that are never resolved and come to terms with it. As Madelon pointed out, there are negatives, there are positives. There are also negatives and positives in this as well, and I'll talk about them very briefly. But first of all, many people don't even know where Estonia is. So here it is. It's, I wish I knew how to, there it is. It's right there. And there they fled across the Baltic. There, Sweden, came by England to Canada, and so forth and so on. A lot of people think, in fact, Newt Gingrich kind of said a while ago, he said, when Trump was talking very cavalierly about not defending the Baltics against Russian aggression, Gingrich said, well, Estonia is merely a suburb of St. Petersburg. So I wanted to make it clear, we've lived in that place for 7,000 to 10,000 years. We speak a Finno-Ugrian language, non-Indo-European, non-Slavic, non-Germanic. We became independent in 1918, and then with the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, the Soviets came in 40 to 41, then the Nazis came, then the Soviets came back. And we regained our freedom in 1991 again. And now, we're members of NATO, the European Union. The last measure of the PISA test, Estonia ranks 3rd in education behind Singapore and Japan. And it's the fastest growing economy in the EU. That's after being molested, being raped for 50 years, basically. And when this is the whole thing about when I say, about oppression, I would talk about what was going on there. And people looked at me and said, you don't look like somebody who's being oppressed. And yet in my heart, I knew what was going on. There was an ethnocide to Russify us out of existence. There's only 1 million of us in the first place. 25% of the population was lost. So we're down to 700,000. That's the tipping point. That's the tipping point, and so forth and so on. So that's where we're from, and that's what we do. And I have a bunch of stuff in here that I'm not going to go through in great detail. But the point is, that there's an upside, there's a downside to being marginal. And marginality comes from living on the edge of 2 conflicting cultures and societies simultaneously, and not a member of each. So you don't belong to either. And there's been much talk about feelings of belonging. Charles Darwin gets a bad rap. He wrote in the 1870s about that's evolutionary progress. We became who we are through the sense of belonging and forming cooperative connections to others. And the thing about it is that it's seeking that, and when we're in that situation of always being on the outside, you don't really have it. But the good thing is you can flip code switch. You can always flip perspectives, and you don't run into the negative stuff that Madelon mentioned, which is believing you're right, because there isn't anything absolute. Everything becomes relative And you have a sensitivity, a deep sensitivity to other discriminated against, stigmatized, and marginalized people. And I think that's an asset. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be here with you all. Thank you so much to Lucille and Michael and Art and Ideas for inviting me to be part of this amazing panel. I'm not really sure how I can follow that, but I'll give it a go. As you've heard earlier, my name's Amal. I'm African, Middle Eastern, former refugee, Muslim, Scottish, British for the moment, European for the moment, and finally activist. But I think before any of that, I'm a human being, just like you all. Now, when I was thinking about citizenship, for me, citizenship means quite a lot of things. And that's why I went through all of those things that form my identity. For me, citizenship is about belonging, being part of a community, feeling welcome, feeling respected and treated with dignity as well, but also active participation. I moved to the UK 17 years ago with my mother from East Africa. We went to the UK to seek asylum. I was 10 years old at that time, and we lived in London for a year and a half. And at that time, we were still waiting for our kind of asylum status to be either accepted or rejected. And my mom was pregnant with my wee sister at that time, so we were living with other people. And when my sister Zaina was born, my mom had approached the Home Office to see if we could have our own accommodation because it was too crowded for all of us to live in that place together. So when she went to the Home Office and said, look, can we have our own place, and explain the situation, they said, yes, that's fine, we can give you your own place, but we don't house asylum seekers in London anymore. We would have to disperse you elsewhere. So we thought, 5 minutes from London, 10 minutes from London, should it be a problem, you know? But they didn't tell us where they were taking us. And I still remember that day, a huge coach came with lots of different families in this coach. And I felt like we did a tour of the UK that day because families were being dropped off, you know, in different cities. And my family were not getting off. And we thought, what's going on here? So my mom had asked me to go and ask the driver to see, like, what's the situation? What's going on here? Are we even on this list? So I went up to the driver and I said, excuse me, sir, is my family on your list? And he said, yes, you're on the list, but you're last. And I thought, my goodness, where are we going? Why are we last? And he said, it's because you're going to Glasgow. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? And he was like, you know, Glasgow? And I was like, no, I don't know. And he's like, it's in Scotland? And I was like, oh my goodness, where's Scotland? You know, never heard of Glasgow, let alone Scotland. So it was an interesting experience, but one thing I always say is that I'm so grateful, and I feel I feel really lucky, and it's probably the best thing that's happened to me and my family. I love Glasgow, I love Scotland for many reasons, but mostly for the welcoming that we received. And I'm pretty sure the Home Office regrets sending me to Glasgow now, but you know, and you'll but you'll find out in a moment why. So we went to Glasgow, and I started Drumchapel High School. And in the year 2004, we were granted leave to remain, which is basically a refugee status. And I remember feeling really guilty because I knew my other friends who were also asylum seekers were still waiting for that piece of paper to say if they could stay in the UK or not. But we kind of got on with life. And then a year later, something happened that changed my life forever. One of my school friends, Agnesa, a Roma gypsy from Kosovo, was down-raided and detained. She was 15, and so was I. Basically, on a Sunday morning, 14 Home Office officials and police officers wearing bulletproof vests went to my friend's house and bulldozed down the door and handcuffed Agnesa handcuffed her father in front of Agnesa and her younger brothers and treated them like criminals. She'd been living in Glasgow for 5 years at that time, and No one chooses to be an asylum seeker. Nobody chooses to be a refugee. It's a state of desperation. Nobody wants to leave their family, their culture, their friends for no reason, you know? So when that happened, I remember finding out about this the following day, and I went to my bilingual teacher, Mr. Garvin, total legend, by the way, and I said, look, sir, I don't know anything about campaigning, I don't know anything about politics, but I have to do something. That could have been my family being treated like that. The UK is a country that champions human rights, so why is Agnesa and her two younger brothers being treated like criminals? You know, that would never happen to a British citizen. Why is it happening to Agnesa? And I thought, okay, let me speak to your head teacher and so on. And then before I knew it, my face was on the news. I was in the newspaper. And I used my voice. And I guess that's where my political consciousness awakened. And I thought, I need to stand up for Agnesa and her family. I don't know what I can achieve, but I have to do something. And 5 other girls joined me, and we became known in the media as the Glasgow Girls. We started a petition in school, and almost everybody signed it, which was amazing, because when we first started high school, there was quite a lot of issues in terms of racism, and people didn't understand who are asylum seekers and refugees and so on and so forth. So when everybody signed it, it was so overwhelming, and we presented that to our local politician, who then invited us to go to the Scottish Parliament, and we met the former First Minister, Jaak Rakfeldt, as well, who unfortunately made a lot of promises to us that he could not keep, because we don't have control over immigration in Scotland. It's basically in Westminster. But to be fair to him, I think he genuinely wanted to help us. He saw 7 school teenagers who were just really determined. And I think citizenship is interesting when it comes to the youth, because for me, one of the things I always get called is fearless. And I'm not sure I can call myself fearless anymore, because I'm not young and as kind of determined. I am determined, I guess, but when I was at that age, I couldn't see, the kind of middle ground. For me, it was right and wrong. And I guess that's something I really miss a lot. And I think a lot of young people have a lot of power. And like you heard earlier that our story got turned into a musical and a film. And for us, it wasn't just about the kind of cause. It was about trying to raise awareness to young people that if we can achieve that, then you can. So 3 weeks later, Agnesa and her family were granted leave to remain, which is fantastic. And she now works in Glasgow, and she's quite happy. But we did lose a lot of family. Unfortunately, a lot of the families that we tried to help were deported. And that, for me, being an activist is such an important part of my citizenship, if you like. So after leaving school, I went to university and I studied community development, and I did a master's in human rights and international politics. And then I started working for the Mental Health Foundation with asylum seeking and refugee women. So we raise awareness about mental health problems using the arts. And it's really interesting hearing their stories and the constant frustration that people go through, because that living in limbo for so long, not knowing when that piece of paper is going to come through your door, it causes so many mental health problems. Asylum seekers are not allowed to work. They're not allowed to go to university. If they do so, they would have to pay international fees. Asylum seekers only receive £5 a day. I'll let you do the math. And also, there's a lot of barriers in terms of language. There's still a lot of racism, and now a lot of Islamophobia, and also other forms of discrimination and destitution. One of the most inspiring people I know is a woman called Jan. She's a volunteer with us at MHF. She's been seeking asylum for over 23 years. She still doesn't know if she can stay in the UK or not. She has no home. She has no access to any funding or any kind of, resources in terms of money and so on. And if it wasn't for other people helping her out, she would have been in the street. So imagine living for so long. She went to the UK when she was 13. She's in her 30s now. And she just has so much potential, and she really wants to contribute in so many ways, but she can't. She's doing an outstanding job at the moment, just kind of volunteering in different places. And I managed to kind of encourage her to do a lot of public speaking and, share her story. And the first time she did it was in front of 300 students. I was like, there you go, good luck. Needless to say, she was amazing. I mean, some of the students were actually running after us at the end, just saying how much of an impact it had. But we still go through a lot of issues as well in terms of kind of personally, professionally. One example I always share is being in a taxi. And I've lived, as you know, I've lived most of my life in the UK, but when I'm in a taxi, the taxi driver will say, "So, where are you from?" And I'm like, here we go. And I say, you know, I'm from here. Yeah, but no, where are you really from? Like, you know, and I was like, from here. And then, you know, it just goes on until they eventually want to find out because I just give up with them. To the point that once, I get so annoyed when that happens. So once I was in a taxi and the taxi driver still said the same thing. So where are you from? And I was like, I'm from Scotland. He's like, yeah, I know. I was just asking where in Glasgow you're from. Oh, man. You know, so I learned my lesson. But another thing as well I'd like to share with you, even though I have a British passport, you know, my place of birth is in Africa. And before I was coming to the States, I was so worried. And it's something that nobody should have to go through, you know? Being worried that I was going to be detained or questioned because I happened to be born in a different country and have a faith that has nothing to do with anyone else. It's personal to me. As long as I'm a good human being and I treat people with kindness, why does it matter where I was born? And I should say we had a lovely immigration officer. He was cracking jokes and everything. I started wondering, oh my goodness, what's happening here? I'm totally confused. But just to finish off, I really do hope, genuinely believe that there will come a time where we treat each other like human beings and, you know, just fellow citizens of the world rather than, you know, where people come from or where they happen to be born. So I'm really hopeful for that. And it can be hard, especially at the moment with the current political climate. But if we don't stand up for what's right, then who will? Thank you very much.
Just a couple, I think we have about 20 minutes for questions, discussion. I just wanted to say a few things about maybe to prod your memories or your thoughts. They probably don't need a whole lot of prodding at the moment. But John, citizenship as inclusion and exclusion, persons and citizens in our own history, Constitution, human rights in the Constitution. A lot of talk about human rights and citizenship that I've been engaged in, and I never knew about the Constitution as a source of thinking about human rights, so that's great. Madelon, what you know about citizenship depending on what you need to know about it. And if you don't really need to know about it because you're experiencing citizenship, there may be a lot of things you don't know. So there's a sort of structural complacency or a structural anxiety and maybe needing to move beyond that, particularly those of us who may have reason to have a sort of structural complacency and needing to move outside of that for the sake of the greater good and others. Charles, I thought about recognition. Axel Honneth, social philosopher from Germany, and how can you have citizenship if you're being told you're not a person, you're stupid, you're this, you're that? Recognition is about, at the individual level, a recognition of the other's equal right, dignity, gifts. And if you don't have that, and then there's a social level of it too, which involves advocacy. But you have to have that as well. Jaak, the idea of code switching, the idea of what you can learn about citizenship from being outside of it, the idea of identity, what you know from being on the outside, how you construct an identity when you don't have the usual sort of sources of identity, and what we can learn from that. Amal, voice, citizenship and youth paving the way, and where does that voice come from? It's an individual thing. It comes from identity. It comes from relationships. And I just want to say, you may be African, Middle Eastern, and Muslim, but my wee sister, you're Scottish too. So, questions, comments?
Hello. So I recently read a book called Against Citizenship, which argues that the very concept or the term is unhelpful because it's always about inclusion. The flip side is always exclusion. I'm not convinced, partly because I work in a program that's about citizenship. But I'd like to get some thoughts on, is there another term which doesn't sort of have the inclusion-exclusion piece, or is there a way to claim citizenship as a kind of fully inclusive concept?
Maybe I'll say a word, which is I'm worried that there might not right now in our politics be a third way around this problem. That is to say, take, for example, some of the things Charles was talking about, the importance of developing ways of increasing belonging and inclusion within obscenely wealthy countries like the United States right now, which have extraordinary inequality problems, such that obscene wealth isn't shared in a responsible fashion. The more inclusion we're able to develop inside the United States, I think the more pressures there will be to exclude. That is, right now we're in a situation, I think, on the planet in which there are very wealthy countries and there are much poorer countries, and a central form of exclusion is citizenship as guardian of the wealth of the richest countries. And the more we're able to develop social programs that produce inclusion within those wealthy countries, and I for one, hope we can do that, the more pressure there will be on the guardians of that wealth. So I'm in a pretty pessimistic place on this question, really important question that you raise. And I'm not sure that we have a way out of the choice between inclusion within and exclusion without right now. I'm counting on my fellow panelists to have more optimistic things to say so that I can continue.
Thank you all for the presentation. It was very stimulating. And one of the things that made me think about is the role of resistance in thinking about citizenship. And in some way, each of you touched on it, whether it was the overturning of a law that didn't seem right anymore, or resistance because something happened to a close friend. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the role of resistance in citizenship.
Okay, I'll go. Yeah, thank you for your question. It's really important, and I think for me it's part of my human right as well to resist and to stand up for what I believe in a manner that obviously is kind of safe and so on and so forth. I think you can come across a lot of barriers as well and a lot of issues. One of the things that we experience campaigning is receiving death threats. And we still do until this day, unfortunately. And like I said earlier, the rise in racism, but that didn't stop us, clearly. So it's just constantly having to kind of fight a battle coming from all sorts of directions as well. But I think the community support and I guess, you know, we were quite lucky because we were supported by the media, which is really interesting because I think it was a phenomenal, if you like, 7 school teenagers taking on the Home Office. It doesn't happen every day. So, but yeah, I think it was clear that, you know, we did resist, and until this day, we are resisting in different forms. I hope that answered your question. Sorry.
But I think that's an important dynamic in sociology. The sociologist, anthropologist Irving Goffman wrote about this in the 1950s, and he wrote that it is always against something that the self emerges, and it's against, and that's where an identity and sense of self is the core of belonging and citizenship, and I think that the resistance pushing back at something is an important dynamic there.
I'd like to go back for a moment to the pessimism and to the other question, because it took me a while to think about it, but I guess I'm not quite as pessimistic about that. Because if we build inclusion here, we have and can tap things that we haven't tapped yet, ideas that we haven't tapped yet, and connections to the rest of the world. So you are still connected, it seems to me, Amal, not only to Scotland, and by the way, I love your accent, but to you understand something about Africa. And Charles, you understand about Nigeria. And so I think by building a strength here, we are able to see the globe as more connected. And certainly it is connected. I think the idea that we can ever go back to a non-global view is just really ill-informed. It just isn't going to work backing up that way. So I'm not. And I think it relates to in part to the other question, that we should take pride in what America has stood for. It's not all bad. We've done good things. We're not perfect by a long shot, and we have to learn from one another. But building inside doesn't mean necessarily that doesn't spread out to others. We just haven't heard their voices yet.
Let me respond a little to the resistance. I mean, if you go back to as far as possible, women couldn't vote until they resisted. The right to vote is a core right of a citizen, right? The civil rights, just the idea that certain things should come to you that were basic, you had to fight for it. So I don't know that you can you had to fight for people. So I think it's almost integral to the whole idea of, if you feel that some things are being deprived you, you have to fight for it. And that would be the resistance. Now, the question is, do you have the resources to fight? Do you know you can? Do you have the power? You know you might die from it. You might get death threats. What are you going to do about the potential consequences? But fight you must, I think.
Really grateful to be here tonight with this amazing panel on this very important topic. So thank you, everybody. Last week I listened to Timothy Snyder speak at the Yale Center for British Art as part of the Arts and Ideas Festival. And in his little book, which is probably the most important book I've ever put my hands on, he talks about how Trump uses the word "the people," and how that is a code word for "I don't know. I don't feel it's me." When he says, the people, and it's said in such a way, and it's coming from such a framework that I don't really know what that means, and I don't think it includes me. Can someone address that?
I'll sort of try to address something, and I'm going to go back to Annie's question. That I want to put in a vote for inclusion and exclusion, because inclusion and exclusion can be a sort of point of tension around which we ask these questions. What do you mean by the people? Who gets to be included? Who gets to be excluded? Who makes those decisions? How do we make those decisions from day to day? That in fact we need to use something that's has a very negative aspect, and use those points of tension to approach the issues and advocate and resist. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
In adolescence, there's a thing called the imaginary audience. It's part of development. And in fact, in adolescence, they often decide to do something because everybody's doing it. But actually, everybody isn't doing it. It's just maybe this message. And certainly advertisement works that way, right? Everybody has this, but nobody actually has it. And so I think it's a similar theme, that we're so told how to think. We're told what to resist, right? We're going to resist that evil force that's somewhere out there. I think we're called to use our own intellect to judge when did we ever have that commonality. I think it is dangerous what's going on, but in all the bad things that have happened, it was a movement, not one person, that made it bad. And so our hope lies in to preventing a movement that's so destructive, right? That's how I think about it. So I think we have an imaginary audience. We have an imaginary belief that we're all agreeing in the same way.
You might say back, we the people, right? That is drawing from a constitution that has done some glorious things, even as it's contained terrible exclusions. So I think we the people is a way to capture the idea of the people, which is going to be necessary for any kind of democratic project, but to put it in a tradition that isn't captured by any particular contemporary political strain. We the people.
So this is a question for Professor Witt. I wonder if you could describe a little bit how the requirements for citizenship have changed over the years.
It's a great question. So as I said at the outset in my remarks, some of the requirements at the outset of the Republic were racial requirements. White people only for naturalization. Those racial requirements persist into the middle of the 20th century. There are other requirements that aren't status-based, and married women and other status-based exclusion from citizenship. But especially picking up at the early part of the 20th century, there were ideological requirements. That is, people could have their citizenship revoked for having certain beliefs, certain radical political beliefs. So a woman like Emma Goldman loses her citizenship in 1918 because she holds beliefs that are too radical for U.S. citizenship. So one of the leading scholars of citizenship in the world, a French scholar named Patrick Weil, who's often here in New Haven, describes American citizenship for much of the 20th century as conditional. It's conditional. It has a set of conditions. If you hold the wrong views, you can lose it. Now, much of that regime has gone away. You can no longer be stripped of your citizenship for almost any reason except lying in your naturalization process. That can produce a revocation of the citizenship that was given to you. The Supreme Court is soon going to decide whether it matters whether you're given your citizenship because of the thing you lied about, or whether just a lie anywhere in the process should give the U.S. government the right to revoke it. It's a lawyer's point. But so those are some of the conditions that have been attached to citizenship for a long time. And what's interesting now, I think, is we have a new form of exclusion, which is the citizenship as gatekeeper to wealth. And that's the new dynamic. It's not a coincidence that Mr. Moreno Santora, from my case at the outset, is born in the Dominican Republic, trying to stay in the United States. That dynamic of poor country to wealthy country is the new exclusion, I think.
Can you comment on buying citizenship?
What was the word?
Being able to buy citizenship.
To buy.
To purchase citizenship. Can you comment on that? Because I just know that in the news recently depends on how much money, if you are able to invest certain $1 million, I don't know the actual amount, that entitles you to, maybe it's a green card, that then allows you to be able to buy your citizenship. I just didn't know much about that. I thought.
Right, this has been in the news. I don't know the details. It's certainly true that access to citizenship or legal status has often been connected in many countries to the benefits the country can derive from your access or your citizenship. This I think, is a widespread phenomenon around the world, and we should expect to see it anywhere. There is a body that gets the right to decide who's in and who's out, is that people will be preferred for inclusion if they seem to have things to offer.
That's right. Okay, thanks.
This will be our last question.
Hi. So a lot of you talked about how the limbo between citizenship and non-citizenship is one of the most damaging places to exist in as a person. And so I was wondering why you think it's almost worse to be neither fully included nor fully excluded, to kind of exist somewhere in the middle.
I think I made the point that it's actually a positive if we really embrace it as a positive. It can be negative, but it can actually be something where it allows for greater flexibility and being able to switch codes and linguistically and perspectives and absolute. You know, when absolutes create problems, when you realize the relativity of all things, then you're more humble. I thought I was making that point.
No, I thought it was
Mm-hmm.
You might think in optimistic times, the capacity to code switch has been celebrated. So human rights has been the project of an optimistic moment in the world, I think, in the 50, 60 years after World War II. In less optimistic moments, and I think here of the amazing mid-20th century philosopher Hannah Arendt, who, looking back at World War II and the chaos of World War II and its aftermath, for someone like Arendt, the crisis was statelessness, and it was not belonging, because in crisis times, having some kind of belonging to produce some sort of stability has seemed incredibly valuable and incredibly important. And so that may be one way to think about it, that belonging, the value of belonging turns in part, is contingent on, in part, the stability or the stability of the situation.
I just want to thank you all, our audience, for coming, for your questions, your attention. I want to thank our panelists for their